March 1315. Rain began in northern Europe. It did not stop for 2 years. 30 million people watched their crops rot in flooded fields. Their cattle collapse from starvation. Their children grow hollow-eyed and weak. Parents abandoned infants in forests. The living ate bark, rats, and the dead. Between 3 and 7 million died, not in months, but across 800 days of slow, grinding horror. Not from war, not from plague, from rain. Northern Europe in the spring of 1315 sustained a population of 30 million people across 400,000 square miles, a density unseen since the fall of Rome, built upon 3 centuries of warm summers and dependable harvests that had convinced an entire civilization it had solved the ancient problem of hunger. The harvest of 1314 across the British Isles, northern France, the Low Countries, because Scandinavia and the German territories had been modest but sufficient, and as winter released its grip in March of 1315, no one suspected that the rain beginning to fall would continue without meaningful interruption for more than 2 years, or that the network of interdependence holding millions together was measured in weeks, not months, of stored grain. The fields awaiting spring plowing stretched from Ireland to Poland, organized into the open field system that had fed explosive population growth for generations. Each manor a self-contained unit where peasants worked strips of land in rotation, growing wheat, rye, barley, and oats that would be ground at the Lord's mill, baked in communal ovens, and consumed as the bread that constituted 70% of most diets. The rhythm of this world was deeply physical, measured in the swing of scythes, the turn of millstones, the smell of bread baking, the sound of cattle lowing in pastures, the sight of grain stocks piled in barns after successful harvests, the taste of ale brewed from barley, the texture of rough bread that kept families alive through winter, all of it woven into a system so familiar it seemed permanent. Village life centered on shared labor and shared risk, with plowing done cooperatively using teams of oxen that belonged to different families, with harvest requiring every available hand in the fields before weather could spoil the crop, with gleaning rights allowing the poorest to gather leftover grain after the main harvest, with common pastures where animals grazed together under the watch of village children. In England, where manorial records would later provide the most detailed accounting of what followed, the royal estates and monastic holdings kept meticulous tallies of seed grain, livestock numbers, and expected yields, documents that assumed a universe where 1 bushel of wheat planted would return 7 bushels at harvest, where cattle and sheep grazed summer pastures and survived on stored hay through winter, where surplus allowed villages to weather a single poor harvest without true distress. The population density in some regions had reached levels that would not be seen again until the 19th century, with villages clustered densely across arable land, towns expanding beyond their walls, cities like Paris and London growing to populations of tens of thousands, all fed by the produce of surrounding countryside, and they all depended on carts and riverboats bringing grain to market each week. The cities, growing denser by the decade, depended entirely on this rural surplus, and London, Paris, Bruges, and dozens of market towns hummed with commerce based on the unspoken assumption that food would arrive each week from the countryside, that granaries held reserves, that the poor could always find bread, even if expensive, even if coarse. Churches and monasteries anchored both spiritual and economic life, their lands often the most productive, their barns the fullest, their populations swelling with peasants seeking the relative security of ecclesiastical lordship, their calendars marking saints' days and harvest festivals that gave rhythm to existence. The spring rains began in earnest in late March 1315 as farmers prepared fields for planting. And at first the moisture seemed a blessing after winter, but the rain did not stop. It intensified day after day, week after week, turning plowed earth to mud, flooding low-lying fields, making it impossible to work the soil at the crucial moment when seeds should go into the ground. By April, when skies should have cleared, the rain continued, cold and unrelenting, driven by weather patterns that had shifted as the medieval warm period gave way to what would later be called the Little Ice Age, temperatures dropping, jet streams altering, Volcanic eruptions, possibly seeding clouds, creating conditions unknown to any living generation. Farmers struggled to plant what they could, wading through waterlogged fields, boots sinking ankle-deep in mud that sucked at every step, their hands numb from cold water, their backs bent against wind-driven rain that soaked through wool cloaks and linen shirts, their faces grim with the knowledge that each day of delay meant a weaker crop, if any crop at all. The seed that made it into the ground sat in cold, saturated soil where grain could not germinate properly, and what little sprouted grew pale and weak under skies that remained gray from dawn to dusk, the young plants yellowing and rotting at the roots. Entire fields taking on a sickly appearance that experienced farmers recognized as harbingers of failure. The rain fell through May, through June, through July, months when sun should have ripened wheat and barley, but instead crops rotted in the fields, and hay intended for winter fodder could not be cut or dried, lying useless and decomposing in sodden meadows, releasing a sweet, sour smell of decay that hung over the countryside like a warning. Peasants brought grain indoors, storing it in urns and pots, trying desperately to keep seed dry for next year's planting. But dampness penetrated everything, and mold spread through stored supplies, rendering them inedible, poisonous even, while outside the endless precipitation continued its assault. The sound of rain became the soundtrack of 1315, a constant drumming on thatched roofs, a steady dripping through leaks that multiplied as straw absorbed water, a gurgling in ditches overwhelmed by runoff, a rushing in streams that burst their banks and spread across low fields, drowning what little crop remained. Harvest time in August brought not the usual relief but confirmation of catastrophe. As what little grain remained standing in the fields was gathered and threshed, and the yields were devastating, in some manners returning only 2 bushels for every bushel planted, in others even less. Ratios that meant eating the seed grain meant starvation later, but not eating it meant starvation now. Prices for wheat, which in normal times cost 5 shillings per quarter barrel, began climbing in autumn 1315, reaching 8 shillings, then 12, then 20, and by winter had surged to 40 shillings, an 8-fold increase that placed bread beyond the reach of laborers whose wages had not changed, whose lords demanded the same rents and tithes regardless of harvest failure. Markets that had once displayed abundant produce now stood nearly empty, with merchants bringing what little they had and demanding prices that provoked anger and despair, with customers arguing and pleading, with transactions breaking down into accusations of hoarding and profiteering, with the social contract that governed commerce fraying under pressure. King Edward II of England, traveling through his realm in August 1315, stopped at the town of St. Albans and discovered that even the royal household could not procure enough bread, a humiliation that revealed how completely the systems of supply had broken down when even a king's purchasing power and authority proved insufficient. Governments attempted intervention, and Edward's parliament fixed prices for wheat, cattle, sheep, chickens, and eggs, mandating that a live cow cost 12 shillings, that 2 dozen eggs sold for a penny, aimed well-intentioned decrees that ignored the central problem, which was not price but availability, and merchants and farmers simply stopped bringing goods to market rather than sell at losses that would ruin them. The price controls collapsed within weeks, and what replaced them was worse. A black market where those with coins could still buy food at extortionate rates, while those without went hungry. A system that rewarded the wealthy and condemned the poor to watch their children weaken day by day. The Archbishop of Canterbury ordered solemn processions throughout the realm, priests leading congregations in prayers for divine mercy, interpreting the crisis through the only framework available as punishment for collective sin. But the rain did not stop, and the processions grew more desperate as autumn turned to winter and stored food dwindled. As 1315 ended, the situation that should have been recovering instead worsened, because the failed harvest meant insufficient seed grain for spring 1316 planting, and the cattle and oxen needed to pull plows were dying, weakened by malnutrition when the hay that should have sustained them through winter had rotted in the fields. The spring of 1316 brought not relief but repetition. More rain, more cold, more failed planting. And now the crisis entered its second year with reserves exhausted, with populations already weakened, with no buffer remaining between survival and death. The realization spread slowly through villages and towns that this was not a single bad year to be endured, but something fundamentally different. A break in the patterns that had governed life for generations. And with that realization came a creeping terror that there might be no recovery, that the world had permanently changed. Peasants, who constituted 95% of the population and had no savings or reserves, made terrible choices, slaughtering the draft animals that were their only means of working land in future years, consuming seed grain that should have been planted, decisions that mortgaged any possibility of recovery for the sake of immediate survival. The meat from slaughtered oxen provided temporary relief, but each animal killed was one fewer to plow fields the following spring, and families who ate their plow teams knew they were consuming not just food, but their capacity to produce future food, a calculation that spoke to the desperation of the moment. When families began to fracture under the pressure, and parents unable to feed their children made the calculation that abandonment offered better odds than watching them slowly starve, leaving young ones at monastery doors, in town squares, in forests, hoping someone with resources might take them in. A trauma so widespread that it would echo in folk tales like Hansel and Gretel for generations. The elderly made different calculations, practicing voluntary starvation, eating less so that younger members of families who still had the strength to work might survive, a quiet horror that passed largely unrecorded, except in the observation that mortality rates among the old spiked dramatically in these years. Crime surged as social order began to crack, and theft of food became so common that it overwhelmed any attempt at enforcement. Peasants stealing from neighbors, travelers robbed on roads, storage buildings broken into, and in Bristol, the City Chronicles recorded that prisoners in the jail tore apart and partially devoured new inmates. An atrocity that spoke to the complete breakdown of civilized restraint. People ate things not meant for human consumption, boiling and consuming bark from trees, digging up roots from forests, chewing grass, catching and eating dogs and horses and any other animal that could be found. And the chroniclers noted grimly that even human flesh was not exempt, though whether reports of cannibalism represented actual practice or the hyperbolic expression of horror remains uncertain. The very concept of normal diet disappeared, replaced by the desperate search for anything that might fill an empty stomach, and the distinctions between food and non-food blurred as people consumed leather, boiled animal hides, ground acorns into bitter paste, and scavenged through waste looking for anything remotely edible. The summer of 1316 passed with no improvement, grain prices remaining catastrophically high, and now a new disaster compounded the existing crisis, as the livestock across northern Europe began dying from disease, murrains that spread through herds weakened by poor nutrition and wet conditions, killing sheep and cattle at rates that approached 80% in some regions. The cattle murrain that began appearing in 1316 and accelerated through 1317 and beyond was possibly rinderpest, a highly contagious viral disease spread through contact and respiratory droplets, with incubation periods of 3 to 15 days that allowed infected animals to travel and mix with others before symptoms appeared, ensuring rapid transmission across regions. Animals infected with the murrain developed fever first, then lost appetite, then began producing discharges from nose and eyes, then developed erosions in the mouth and digestive tract, then suffered acute diarrhea, and most died within 6 to 12 days of symptoms appearing, a progression so rapid that by the time a herd showed signs of illness, the disease had already spread to neighboring farms. On royal manors where records were kept, the losses were staggering. Clipstone having 186 cattle in 1317, but only 64 by 1320. The Winchester estates losing 588 out of 1,088 cattle in a single year. Byfleet losing 13 of 18. Gravesend losing its entire herd. The disappearance of cattle removed not just meat and milk from diets already catastrophically deprived, but eliminated the oxen needed to pull plows, making it impossible to properly work fields even if weather improved, and horses, less common and more expensive. could not fully replace the lost draft animals. The disease did not respect borders or status, and the great monastery of Christ Church, Canterbury, lost over 1,000 cattle by March 1321, a devastating blow to an institution that had been a pillar of stability. And the prior's letters described the relentless advance of the pestilence with a tone of helpless despair. Fields that should have been plowed and planted in the spring of 1318 and beyond lay fallow or were worked inadequately because the animals needed to break the soil were dead. And this created a secondary famine, a lingering hunger that persisted even after weather improved because agricultural capacity had been so thoroughly destroyed. Warfare became impossible under these conditions, and in the summer of 1315, King Louis X of France mobilized an army to invade Flanders. But as his forces entered the low-lying fields of the Netherlands, the waterlogged ground turned to impassable marsh, horses and supply wagons became hopelessly mired in mud, and the French army was forced to retreat, burning provisions they could not carry, defeated not by enemy action, but by rain. By 1317, the third year of crisis, the height of mortality had been reached, and chroniclers recorded that the living could scarcely manage to bury the dead, that mass graves were dug, that ecclesiastical records showed life expectancy dropping from 35 years in the period before 1300 to less than 30 years between 1301 and 1325, a decline driven by deaths concentrated among children, the elderly, and those without resources. The sheer scale of death transformed landscapes, with abandoned homesteads visible across the countryside, with fields reverting to scrub, with entire hamlets in Ireland and northern Germany simply ceasing to exist as survivors fled to larger towns or died without replacement. The weather finally began to moderate in the summer of 1317, and harvests that year were better, not abundant, but sufficient to halt the immediate starvation. And though by this point the population was so weakened by malnutrition and disease that pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis killed thousands more who might have survived in normal times. Recovery proved agonizingly slow because so much seed grain had been consumed, so many draft animals were dead, so many workers had perished or lacked the strength to labor effectively, and it would not be until 1322 that food supplies approached normal levels. Not until 1325 that populations began to grow again rather than decline. The famine fundamentally altered European society, ending the optimism and expansion that had characterized the previous 3 centuries, introducing a harsher, more violent mentality that would manifest in the warfare of the 14th century, showing when the chivalric codes of earlier generations gave way to the brutal tactics of the 100 Years' War. The church, despite its processions and prayers, had been unable to stop the disaster, and this failure planted seeds of doubt about institutional authority that would grow in subsequent decades. While governments proved equally helpless, their attempts at price controls and rationing ineffective against the sheer scale of the crisis. The Great Famine also left Europe in a profoundly weakened state that would have consequences 3 decades later, when the Black Death arrived in 1347 and swept through populations still not fully recovered, still living in the shadow of those years when the rain did not stop and the harvest did not come, and millions died because the sky turned against them. The famine demonstrated with terrible clarity that medieval civilization, for all its cathedrals and universities and commercial networks, rested on a foundation of agricultural surplus that could disappear in a single season, that the difference between prosperity and starvation was measured not in years but in months, that when harvest failed 2 years in a row, there was no system capable of preventing mass death. What happened in Northern Europe between 1315 and 1322 was not a temporary disruption, but a revelation of fragility. A lesson that populations living at the carrying capacity of their environment have no margin for error, that weather patterns can shift without warning, that the systems humanity builds to protect against disaster often prove inadequate when truly tested. Today, when agricultural technology has advanced beyond what medieval farmers could imagine, when global supply chains can move food from surplus to deficit regions within days, when weather forecasting provides warning of coming storms, it remains difficult to fully grasp how helpless people were in the face of continuous rain, how quickly order dissolved, how complete the collapse became. The chronicles and manorial records from those years, preserved in archives across Europe, speak in the language of statistics and agricultural yields. But beneath the numbers lies an experience of sustained terror, of watching children grow hollow-eyed and weak, of making impossible choices about who would eat and who would not, of discovering that the institutions and beliefs that ordered society provided no protection when the fundamental basis of survival disappeared. The rain that began falling in the spring of 1315 did not seem, at first, like the beginning of catastrophe, just unusually persistent weather that would surely clear. And this is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire episode, that the people experiencing it had no way to know they were entering years of horror. No framework for understanding that this was not a temporary setback, but a fundamental shift in the climate system. No warning that they should prepare for the end of everything they had built.